Hello and welcome. In our ongoing exploration of science and faith, there's a certain objection that comes up time and time again. Today, we're going to take a close look at this cliché, the skeptic's favorite. And by the end of our time together, you'll have the philosophical tools you need to really deconstruct it. Sound familiar? You've probably heard some version of this before. It's usually said with this air of certainty, as if it's the final word in any discussion about cosmic origins. This, right here, is the God of the Gaps objection in a nutshell. So, what exactly is the God of the Gaps argument? Well, at its heart, it's the claim that faith is basically just a placeholder for scientific ignorance. The idea is that as science learns more and more, the space for God just gets smaller and smaller until it eventually disappears. But as we're about to see, this objection rests on some pretty shaky philosophical ground. So here's our roadmap. We're going to dismantle this objection piece by piece, looking at 4 key counterarguments, and then we'll see how the challenge actually gets turned back to the skeptic. First up, let's talk about the nature of the skeptic's own faith. Right, so let's start with a bit of irony here. This objection is often presented as the height of rational, evidence-based thinking. But it turns out it's actually built on its own kind of faith. Now, think about what this really means. When someone says, oh, science will explain it someday, they aren't arguing from the evidence we have now. What they're really doing is appealing to some unknown future discovery. In a way, it's kicking the problem down the road instead of dealing with the data in front of us. And this is the crucial takeaway. The objection isn't really about the current evidence at all. It's a statement of faith in where science might go. The person making the objection is basically admitting that, as things stand today, a designer is a very compelling explanation. This leads us right into our second major problem. The whole God of the Gaps idea is built on this assumption that science is always just closing gaps, right? That it's this linear march of progress. But is that really how science works? If you look at the history of science, you see a much more interesting story. Sometimes a huge discovery doesn't give us a simple answer. Instead, it pulls back a curtain to reveal a level of complexity we couldn't have even dreamed of, creating a much bigger gap than the one we thought we were closing. Take the biological cell, for example. 100 years ago, we thought it was just a simple little blob of protoplasm. The origin of life seemed like a puzzle we were close to solving. But then, we discovered DNA. We now know that even the simplest cell is like a miniature city with a vast, incredibly complex information coding system. That discovery didn't close a gap, it opened up a chasm. This brings us to our third point, which is all about understanding the limits of our tools. We need to be really clear about what kind of questions science is even designed to answer. Look, science is an absolutely brilliant tool. It's fantastic for figuring out the mechanics of the universe, all the how questions. But when we start asking those bigger questions, the why questions about ultimate meaning and purpose, well, that's where science, by its very design, tends to go quiet. I mean, just think about some of the deepest mysteries. Why do the fundamental constants of our universe seem so perfectly dialed in for life to exist? What was there before the beginning? What is the actual origin of life from non-life? Or the nature of our own subjective consciousness? Science can describe these things, but it hasn't really gotten us any closer to answering the deep metaphysical questions behind them. I love this analogy because it captures the issue perfectly. It's not a knock on science to point out its limitations. It's just about recognizing that you need the right tool for the right job. Science is the thermometer, philosophy and metaphysics, they're the ruler. And that leads us to our final and, I think, most powerful point. The God of the Gaps objection makes a classic philosophical mistake. It's called a category error. You see, the argument for a designer isn't a scientific hypothesis that you pop into a gap in our data. It's a philosophical conclusion. It's an inference based on the sum total of the evidence we have. It's not an argument from what we don't know. It's an argument based on what we do know. This way of thinking has a name in philosophy. It's called inference to the best explanation. And it's a perfectly valid, rational way to reason. It's not about finding a magical answer because we're ignorant. It's about looking at all the data and asking, what is the most rational, the most coherent explanation for all of this? So where does all of this leave us? We've seen that the God of the Gaps objection isn't the intellectual trump card it's often made out to be. So let's quickly recap the tools we now have to analyze it.
So to summarize, first, the objection itself requires a kind of blind faith. Second, science often widens gaps instead of closing them. Third, science is simply the wrong tool for these kinds of metaphysical questions. And fourth, the design argument isn't a science filler, it's a philosophical inference. And because of all that, the burden of proof really shifts. Just saying God of the Gops isn't enough anymore. The real challenge for the skeptic is to look at the evidence we have, the fine-tuning, the complexity of life, and provide an explanation that's actually better and more coherent.
And that leaves us with a final question to think about. What's the real intellectual challenge here? Is it for the believer to fill in a scientific gap? Or is it for the skeptic to provide a better explanation for the incredible data we already possess? I'll leave you to ponder that. I look forward to our next session.